34 kilometers. That is the exact width of the global economic jugular. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is a mere sliver of dark water separating the Arabian Peninsula from Iran. Yet through this geographic anomaly pumps 20% of the planet's oil supply, a third of its internationally traded fertilizers, and the liquefied natural gas keeping Europe industrialized. Today, that artery is severed. We are currently hemorrhaging through the most catastrophic supply disruption in the history of the energy market, eclipsing the 1970s oil shock and triggering an irreversible cascade of sovereign distress across the global south. The Pentagon is stretched thin. The Royal Navy is calculating acceptable losses. The consensus among defense analysts was that uncoiling this geopolitical noose would require a coalition of traditional maritime superpowers bleeding capital for months. They were dead wrong. The blueprint to shatter the Iranian blockade is not emerging from Washington, and the vanguard deploying to clear the world's most dangerous maritime kill zone is a nation that technically lacks a conventional navy. The savior is Ukraine. Putin is furious. The math is brutal. To understand why a global superpower is paralyzed while a besieged Eastern European nation steps into the breach, you must strip away the political theater and look at the raw, unforgiving bathymetry of the Persian Gulf. Naval intelligence does not view the Strait of Hormuz as a mere maritime transit corridor. They classify it as a bathymetric nightmare, a heavily constrained tactical cage perfectly engineered for asymmetric sea denial. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, has weaponized this geography, saturating the choke point with a dense, unmapped network of smart naval mines. This is not the crude contact mine warfare of the 20th century. This is sensor-fused, multi-layered maritime obliteration. Firepower means nothing. The IRGC's current strategy relies heavily on two specific technological variants, the Mayhem 3 and the Mayhem 7. The Mayhem 3 is a deep-water heavyweight, tethered up to 100 meters below the surface and armed with a 300-kilogram warhead. It utilizes a sophisticated array of passive acoustic and magnetic sensors, patiently listening for the specific acoustic signature and magnetic displacement of a commercial supertanker or a multi-billion-dollar destroyer. When the algorithm registers a match, it does not require physical contact to detonate. The resulting 300-kilogram underwater explosion does not merely punch a hole in a ship. It generates a massive, rapidly expanding gas bubble that lifts the vessel's keel out of the water, snapping the ship's spine before dropping it back into the void. Hull integrity vanishes. Closer to the surface, the IRGC deploys the Mayhem 7, a 220-kilogram assassin explicitly designed for the shallow, contested waters of the strait. The Mayhem 7 introduces a terrifying variable into the naval equation. Its physical casing is a conical shape, mathematically engineered to deflect the acoustic pings of standard active sonar away from the searching vessel. When a traditional minehunter sweeps the area, the Mayhem 7 effectively absorbs and scatters the signal, rendering itself virtually invisible to conventional detection methods. They are blind. Compounding this technological threat is the fundamental physics of the Persian Gulf itself. The water in the strait is heavily stratified, featuring dramatic temperature gradients and extreme salinity variations known as thermoclines. These thermoclines act as impenetrable acoustic mirrors. When a standard warship projects a sonar ping from its hull, the sound waves hit these thermal layers and unpredictably bend, scatter, or bounce back, creating a chaotic wall of acoustic fog. A state-of-the-art guided missile cruiser could be sitting 50 meters above a Mayhem 3, and its fixed-hull sonar would register absolutely nothing but the thermal static of the Gulf. This is where the Ukrainian deployment transitions from a symbolic gesture into a devastating tactical masterstroke. Sitting in Portsmouth right now are the Chernihiv and the Cherkasy, two Sandown-class minehunters transferred to Ukraine. While their top speed of 13 knots makes them irrelevant in a conventional surface engagement, their specialized hardware makes them the apex predators of this specific environment. The linchpin of their capability is the Sonar 293 Variable Depth Sonar, VDS. Unlike the fixed systems that blind American and British heavy surface combatants in the Gulf, the transducer head of the Sonar 293 physically detaches from the hull. It is lowered on a mechanized cable, plunging directly through the acoustic fog of the thermal layers. The advantage is absolute. By operating beneath the thermocline, the Ukrainian VDS optimizes acoustic performance based on the specific water temperature gradients, completely bypassing the Gulf's natural camouflage. The variable depth capability allows the operators to look up and across the water column, painting the underside of the conical Maham 7s and stripping away their radar-evading geometry. It illuminates the Maham 3s before their magnetic triggers can engage. The Pentagon has openly admitted that clearing the strait with their currently stretched assets could take up to 6 grueling months. Ukraine is injecting purpose-built, NATO-integrated, thermocline-piercing technology directly into the kill zone. They are not going to fight the physics of the Strait of Hormuz. They are going to surgically dissect it. Before February 28th, the Russian Federation was financially bleeding out. According to the International Energy Agency, by February 2026, Russia's oil and petroleum export revenues had plummeted to a wartime low of $9.5 billion. Export volumes had collapsed to 6.6 million barrels per day, levels unseen since the initial 2022 invasion. This was not a macroeconomic accident. It was the result of a deliberate attritional campaign waged by Ukrainian unmanned systems. Kiev's relentless drone strikes on the Baltic ports of Primorsk and Ust-Luga had effectively decapitated Russian physical oil export volumes by an astonishing 40%. The internal domestic metrics were equally catastrophic. The IMF slashed Russian full-year growth forecasts to a stagnant 0.8%, while corporate bankruptcies violently spiked by 31% to over 568,000 cases in a single year. Inflation was burning through critical civilian sectors at over 10%. Putin was facing a strategic terminal velocity, trapped in a reality where sustaining his military expenditures required the total cannibalization of the Russian domestic economy. He was losing. Then, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps saturated the Strait of Hormuz with Maham-class naval mines, and the global energy market suffered an aneurysm. The closure of the world's most vital petroleum artery triggered an immediate and violent repricing of global risk. Brent crude shattered the $100 per barrel threshold almost instantly, surging mercilessly toward $120. This was the exact moment the geopolitical architecture inverted. The mines tethered in the dark waters of the Persian Gulf were no longer just Iranian tactical assets. They had become the most profitable financial instruments in the Russian arsenal. The windfall was instantaneous. Financial Times analysts calculated that by early March, the sheer gravitational pull of the Hormuz disruption was generating an additional $150 million per day in pure, unadulterated profit for the Kremlin. This was not a gradual recovery. Within the first 2 weeks of the crisis, Moscow vacuumed up between $1.3 billion and $1.9 billion in unexpected supplementary oil export tax revenues. The mechanics of the global oil trade were entirely short-circuited. Russian crude, which had spent years heavily discounted beneath Brent prices due to grueling Western sanctions, was suddenly being sold to desperate buyers at a premium. Nations that had spent 4 years dutifully weaning themselves off Russian energy were thrust into a panic-buying frenzy because 20% of the world's supply was sitting trapped behind an invisible wall of Iranian sensors. Sanctions became irrelevant. Chatham House, the preeminent British international affairs think tank, diagnosed the situation with chilling clarity, describing the Iran war and the subsequent maritime blockade as a massive economic gift for Putin. Prior to the strait's closure, the Kremlin was effectively pawning the future of the Russian state to fund the grinding artillery barrages in the Donbass. The Hormuz windfall eliminated that pressure entirely. Every single day that those acoustic mines remain armed in the shallow thermoclines of the Gulf, the Russian war chest swells by $150 million. Over the course of a single week, that translates to over $1 billion of excess capacity injected directly into the Russian war machine. The connection is absolute. There is no abstract separation between the Middle Eastern theater and the Eastern European front. The Maham 3s denying entry to commercial shipping in the Gulf are directly subsidizing the glide bombs, obliterating Ukrainian infrastructure. The Iranian blockade is functioning as a massive, offshore central bank for the Russian Ministry of Defense. This is precisely why Kiev mobilized the Chernihiv and the Cherkasy with such unprecedented speed. They recognize that variable depth sonar is not merely a tool for clearing shipping lanes. It is an instrument of macroeconomic warfare. Dropping those detachable transducer heads below the Gulf's thermal layers is the only way to puncture the global oil price bubble. Neutralizing the mines reopens the strait, unleashes the trapped supply, and immediately collapses the Brent crude premium. The pipeline dies. To accurately measure the blast radius of the Hormuz closure, you have to look beyond the immediate belligerents and examine the historical echoes of the Persian Gulf. In the late 1980s, during the climax of the Iran-Iraq War, the region descended into the tanker war. It was a brutal campaign of maritime attrition where archaic contact mines and anti-ship missiles crippled commercial shipping, ultimately forcing the United States to launch Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since World War II. But the tactical geometry of the 1980s was primitive compared to the 2026 reality. The mines were dumb, the global economy was less tightly integrated, and the petroleum supply chains possessed a degree of elasticity. This is structurally different. Macroeconomic contagion modeling, the kind of intensive data analysis pioneered by institutions like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, confirms what the bond markets are already pricing in. The second-order effects of this specific naval blockade are systematically dismantling the global South. We are not just witnessing a regional disruption. We are watching the absolute largest supply shock in the history of the global oil market violently rip the floor out from under emerging economies. The raw mathematical scale of this crisis completely eclipses the infamous 1970s oil shock. The bystanders are burning. Look at the economic carnage unfolding in Vietnam, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. These nations did not participate in the joint declarations at Northwood, nor do they dictate terms in the Kremlin or Washington, yet they are bearing the immediate brutal brunt of the kinetic fallout. All three nations have been forced into catastrophic nationwide fuel emergencies. When Brent crude violently rockets past $120 a barrel, these sovereign governments face an impossible mathematical trilemma. They can subsidize the fuel and trigger a sovereign debt crisis. They can let the market float and watch hyperinflation incinerate their domestic stability, or they can simply shut down the grid. Factories are going dark. The manufacturing engines that power global retail are grinding to a halt. Commercial airlines are aggressively slapping predatory fuel surcharges onto international logistics networks that are already fracturing under the geopolitical strain. The poorest pay first, but the most glaring strategic irony of the entire crisis is unfolding directly adjacent to the kill zone itself. The Gulf Arab states command some of the highest per capita GDPs on the planet, standing as bastions of hypermodernity and immense sovereign wealth. Yet, they possess a fatal geographic vulnerability. Over 80% of their essential food imports must physically transit the 34-kilometer gauntlet of the Strait of Hormuz. Sovereign wealth is utterly irrelevant when the container ships carrying your grain refuse to navigate a thermocline saturated with Iranian acoustic mines. Supermarket shelves across the Arabian Peninsula are physically emptying. In a desperate bid to stave off a domestic hunger crisis, these incredibly wealthy governments have resorted to airlifting basic agricultural staples. Air freighting grain is madness. It is an unsustainable, cash-burning logistical nightmare that proves the fundamental, terrifying premise of the IRGC's blockade. Tehran has successfully weaponized starvation alongside energy. By paralyzing the strait, they have placed a physical chokehold on the baseline survival of millions of people who have absolutely nothing to do with the stalled nuclear negotiations in Islamabad. The entire global architecture is being held hostage by a few hundred smart mines anchored in warm, shallow water. The United States cannot clear it fast enough. The Gulf states cannot buy their way around it. The global South cannot survive it. Enter the Ukrainians. For the first 2 years of the conflict, the geopolitical consensus surrounding Eastern Europe was anchored by a singular, unyielding legal mechanism, the 1936 Montreux Convention. When Turkey invoked the treaty to seal the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits to warships, it clamped a massive strategic constraint over the entire Black Sea theater. The Kremlin calculated that this legal cage would permanently suffocate Ukrainian maritime ambitions. Having systematically devastated Ukraine's conventional naval assets in the opening salvos of the invasion, Vladimir Putin believed he had permanently eradicated Kyiv's ability to project traditional sea power. He miscalculated entirely. Ukraine did not accept the geographic containment. They ruthlessly adapted to it. Stripped of their heavy surface combatants, Kyiv pioneered a decentralized, asymmetric doctrine of unmanned surface vessels and drone warfare, violently forcing the retreat of the Russian Black Sea Fleet from the occupied ports of Crimea without ever fielding a single traditional warship. But while the Montreux Convention technically capped what Ukraine could physically deploy in its own immediate waters, it possessed a catastrophic blind spot for the Kremlin. The treaty did not restrict Ukraine from projecting power elsewhere. The map expanded. What we are witnessing with the mobilization of this mine countermeasures fleet is the execution of a breathtaking strategic inversion. By deploying these heavily specialized vessels thousands of miles away from the grueling attritional trench warfare of the Donbass, Ukraine is actively bypassing the Montreux constraints. They are leaping over the Turkish blockade. Consider the composition of the fleet itself. Alongside the British-supplied Sandown-class ships, Ukraine is fielding the Mariupol and the Melitopol, tripartite-class vessels boasting a legacy of genuine Cold War multinational engineering. Originally forged through a 1973 agreement where France provided the electronics, Belgium managed the navigation, and the Netherlands handled propulsion, these hulls represent the pinnacle of European shared naval construction. Now they fly the Ukrainian flag. These are not rogue assets acting in isolation. They are the physical manifestation of NATO interoperability, operating in seamless coordination with the British Royal Navy, executing joint maneuvers alongside French maritime assets, and syncing target data with Italian logistics platforms. This is a combat-hardened, globally connected naval force projecting definitive capability directly into the Persian Gulf, the paradigm shattered. This maneuver fundamentally rewrites the international perception of the Ukrainian state. For the better part of 4 years, the diplomatic corridors of Washington, London, and Brussels have overwhelmingly viewed Kyiv through the lens of a desperate aid recipient. They were the besieged nation that required endless infusions of artillery shells, financial bailouts, and immense political capital just to maintain baseline sovereignty. But as the Chernihiv and the Cherkasy prepare to penetrate the acoustic fog of the Strait of Hormuz, that identity is undergoing a violent, irreversible transformation. Ukraine is no longer waiting in the antechamber for Western assistance. They are volunteering for the world's most dangerous vanguard mission on a global stage. They provide security. This transition from a dependent client state into an active, lethal security provider is the ultimate exercise in hard power diplomacy. Ukraine is effectively trading its specialized mine clearance capabilities and combat-tested maritime expertise for lucrative, long-term strategic positioning. This is explicitly confirmed by the diplomatic architecture being built in real time. President Zelensky has rapidly leveraged this deployment to secure comprehensive 10-year defense partnerships with immensely wealthy Gulf Arab states. Crucially, these sweeping agreements are not limited to traditional military training. They specifically include the export and integration of the very same Ukrainian sea drones that obliterated the Russian fleet in Sevastopol. The empire grows. This is the hidden machinery of the Hormuz operation. Ukraine is utilizing the global energy panic to aggressively build a post-war defense export architecture, embedding itself permanently into the security calculus of the Middle East. Putin authorized the initial invasion under the catastrophic delusion that he could neutralize a regional adversary in a matter of days. Instead, his aggression has systematically forged the exact geopolitical weapon he feared most. He has inadvertently birthed a hardened, technologically advanced maritime power that is currently leading a multinational coalition from British ports, utilizing British-built ships, crewed by Ukrainian sailors who have been meticulously trained by the Royal Navy. They are establishing themselves as a premier battle-tested defense partner that other sovereign nations desperately want on their side when the global order begins to fracture. When a Ukrainian variable-depth sonar strips the acoustic camouflage off an Iranian Mayhem-class mine, it does not merely reopen a commercial shipping lane. It mathematically proves that Ukraine does not need access to the Black Sea to devastate Russian geopolitical interests or to secure absolute global relevance. They can cripple Putin's war economy, safeguard the European energy grid, and forge multi-billion-dollar defense pacts simultaneously from the shallow, fiercely contested thermoclines of the Gulf of Oman. The trap closes. We are witnessing the violent, real-time construction of a genuinely new global security architecture. It was not drafted in advance by diplomats in Geneva, nor was it the product of a unified grand strategy. It was forcefully hammered into existence by the simultaneous collision of multiple compounding crises. The calculus has changed. Vladimir Putin's entire strategic framework for the subjugation of Europe is entirely dependent upon a baseline assumption of Western division. His operational blueprint requires the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to fracture over minor disagreements, for European capitals to be hopelessly slow to mobilize, and for the American defense apparatus to be fatally distracted by secondary theaters. He launched his invasion in February 2022 under the catastrophic, terminal delusion that he was initiating a localized, 3-day special military operation against an isolated, fractured neighbor. He was wrong. He completely failed to anticipate that the nation he intended to conquer would evolve into a globally projecting, hardened naval partner. He never calculated that Ukrainian sailors, having mastered NATO interoperability in Portsmouth, would unilaterally deploy to the hostile waters of the Persian Gulf, specifically to sever his critical oil revenues. He did not foresee a reality where the Ukrainian president would be signing sweeping, decade-long defense agreements with the sovereign wealth centers of the Gulf Arab states, actively exporting the exact same unmanned sea drones that humiliated the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The cage closes. When those 4 highly specialized mine countermeasures vessels finally slip their moorings in Portsmouth, transit the Suez Canal, navigate the Red Sea, and break into the Gulf of Oman, they are transporting something infinitely more lethal than variable depth sonar equipment. They are carrying the definitive, undeniable proof that a country the Kremlin assumed was broken 4 years ago is now aggressively rewriting the fundamental assumptions of who actually wields power in this new, unforgiving world. The old order is dead. This is not merely a tactical mind-clearing mission. It is a masterclass in global strategic inversion. We are going to continue tracking every single millimeter of this development, from the shifting coalition dynamics in Northwood to the stalling nuclear negotiations in Islamabad. If you require this level of unvarnished, cold realism analysis to understand the hidden machinery of global conflict, hit the like button right now. It forces the algorithm to distribute actual geopolitical intelligence over political theater. Subscribe immediately to ensure you do not miss a single operational update as this maritime blockade evolves. I want your assessment in the comments below. Do you assess that Ukraine's minehunters will survive the transit to the Strait of Hormuz? And exactly how many days of clearance operations will it take before the Kremlin feels the financial hemorrhage? I will see you in the next briefing. The geopolitical chessboard has effectively run out of squares for the Russian Federation. By heavily financializing the maritime terror inflicted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Vladimir Putin explicitly tied the immediate survival of his war economy to a 34-kilometer stretch of warm, shallow water. He completely outsourced his economic baseline to an inherently volatile proxy, operating under the fatal assumption that the traditional Western powers, fatigued, fractured, and politically paralyzed, lacked the concentrated political will and specialized hardware to break an asymmetric blockade. He underestimated the desperate. The sheer audacity of the Ukrainian deployment fundamentally shatters the illusion of Russian macroeconomic invulnerability. When those 4 highly specialized, NATO-integrated mine countermeasures vessels finally plunge their variable depth sonars into the Persian Gulf, they will not just be neutralizing the Maham-class acoustic threat. They will be actively, systematically dismantling the financial architecture of the Russian invasion. The world's preeminent superpower, the United States, openly admitted it could not predict this precise strategic maneuver from London and Kiev. Washington was caught entirely off guard because it was still operating under a rigid 20th-century framework, failing to recognize that national survival breeds a completely different, ruthless strain of geopolitical innovation. The paradigm is rewritten. This impending operation proves that the traditional prerequisites for global power projection, massive aircraft carrier strike groups, and trillion-dollar defense budgets are being aggressively circumvented. Ukraine is projecting lethal economy-crushing influence across the globe using specialized technology, tactical brilliance, and the absolute audacity to execute a kinetic solution while the legacy powers draft committee statements. The old world burns. The intelligence picture remains violently fluid, and we will ruthlessly track every millimeter of this escalation, from the stalling back-channel negotiations between Washington and Tehran to the specific operational deployment timelines of the clearance coalition. If you demand this caliber of unvarnished, cold realist analysis to navigate an increasingly fractured global order, you must hit the like button immediately to force the algorithm to prioritize raw intelligence over political theater. Subscribe right now to ensure you maintain the tactical edge as this crisis inevitably mutates. Deploy to the comments below and log your definitive assessment. Assuming the Ukrainian vanguard survives the maritime transit to the Strait of Hormuz, precisely how many operational days will it take before the Kremlin's treasury feels the catastrophic financial hemorrhage? I will see you in the next briefing.